We have a series on Messianic Prophecy. Um, and today we've got a few miscellaneous things that all kind of deal with um, some of the things Jesus was doing when he was here on earth, doing, healing, prophesying, um, parables, just some of the things that were characteristic of what he was doing um, while he was here. And so I've got kind of some miscellaneous things, but we'll see if we can string them together a little bit. And um, let's pray, and we'll pick up some of these things. Um, Father, thank you for this day and this opportunity to look at some more prophecy regarding Jesus Christ and uh, as the Messiah and what the Messiah what it was predicted that he would do. Um, and I just pray this be encouraging and edifying as we look at these things. And um, in Christ's name, amen. So let's turn over to Isaiah 35. And uh, before we dive into this, I just want to point out that this is kind of the last message in this series that really deals with um, and points out the things that the Jews clearly were expecting of the Messiah. And although we'll see some things that they didn't pick up even today, but um, depending on what we wind up planning, I may in a couple weeks focus just on really pointing out the break between what the Jews were expecting with the arrival of the kingdom and what actually happened because of the rejection of the kingdom. And so, uh, if we look at Isaiah 35, I'm just going to read this chapter. This is 10 verses. And we're really focused on a couple verses, but I'd like to read this chapter because it does give a bit of a picture as to uh, some of the things that the Jews and those who followed Jesus and believed he was the Messiah, some of the things they were expecting to arrive um, right then. And so let's look at Isaiah 35, and I will just read this chapter. Uh, the wilderness and the solitary place will be glad for them, and the desert will rejoice and blossom as the rose. It will blossom abundantly and rejoice even with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the excellency of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord and the excellency of your God. Uh, and so the desert and the wilderness will blossom, and there will be a change to, we see some places named in verse 2 that are not desert places. Verse 3 says, strengthen you the weak hands and confirm the feeble knees. Say to those that are of a fearful heart, be strong, fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance. God of recompense, he will come and save you. And here's the two verses that were focused on for fulfilled prophecy, verses 5 and 6. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Then shall the lame leap as a hart or a deer, and the tongue of the dumb sing. For in the wilderness will waters break out, and streams in the desert. And the parched ground will become a pool, and the thirsty land springs of water in the habitation of dragons where each lay grass with reeds and rushes. And a highway will be there, and a way, and it will be called the way of holiness. The unclean will not pass over it, but it will be for those, the wayfaring men. Uh, it will be for those, comma, the wayfaring men, though fools, will not err therein. No lion will be there, nor any ravenous beast will go up thereon. It will not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there. And the ransomed of the Lord will return and come to Zion with songs and everlasting joy upon their heads. They will obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. And so there's a big change described in this chapter, uh, a big change to the landscape, um, uh, and some of the dangers of it. In verse 9, we'll leave. Um, and dropped in the middle of this chapter is verses 5 and 6 that speak of the blind seeing and the deaf hearing, um, people suddenly gaining the ability to walk, gaining the ability to speak. If we uh, turn over to Matthew 11, what we see is that when Jesus was questioned about whether or not he really is the Messiah, and in this instance, he points to the miracles that he is performing. Uh, if we look at Matthew 11 and verse 2, it says, "Now when John," and this is John the Baptist, "now when John had heard in the prison the works of Christ, he sent two of his disciples and said to him, 'Are you he that should come, or do we look for another?'" And so John the Baptist, he's been thrown in prison at this point, and he's asking Jesus, "Are you the Messiah, or is it someone else?" And Jesus' response in verse 4, Jesus answered and said to them, "Go and show John again those things which you do hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he whoever will not be uh, offended in me." And so uh, when Jesus gets this question, he refers to the fact that these things are occurring. And Isaiah 35, it really is just one of many chapters that talk about things that the Jews have to look forward to in the future. And we can see the Messiah, he begins doing some of this. And we have some of these miracles where people um, are healed, and there's many examples of that in the Gospels. Um, and but it's very common in the Old Testament. You have um, a piece of what happened when Jesus came to earth, and it's dropped in the middle of something speaking about the kingdom that has not yet happened. And what this boils down to really is the fact that Jesus did offer them a kingdom. The kingdom, he is the Messiah. He came as the Messiah and offered the Jews the kingdom. That's an offer that was rejected. Let's turn over to John 11, and let's look at an example of somebody seeing that Christ is, uh, he's performing all these miracles, um, but they have a different reaction to it. Um, and in John chapter 11, what's just happened is that Lazarus has been raised from the dead and walked out of his tomb. And in verse 47, we see the reaction of the religious leaders. Verse 47 says, "Then gathered the chief priests and the Pharisees a council and said, 'What should we do? For this man does many signs.'" If we let him alone, all will believe on him, and the Romans will come and take away our place and nation. So they're not really thinking about the Messiah. This tells you where their head is at. They're worried about their place, um, and nation. They're thinking about the Romans. Now, obviously, if they really believed that Jesus, was the Messiah and was capable of defeating all enemies, they wouldn't be concerned about the Romans. But this is their concern. They're not happy that he's doing these miracles. They're worried because that might mean that people follow him, and then the Romans will come and beat everybody up. That's their concern. They're worried about maintaining their position. And so this is just a quick example of, as we know, that what Jesus offered was rejected, what the Messiah offered, the kingdom that was rejected. These people here in John 11, they did not believe. In these two verses we just read, they did not believe or accept this offer. And so this is a common thing when dealing with Messianic prophecy, because in Messianic prophecy we tend to focus on the prophecy that was fulfilled when Jesus came, that demonstrates he was the Messiah. There's a lot of prophecy that has yet to be fulfilled, that the Jews were expecting. We've seen examples of, even after Christ's resurrection, uh, his disciples say, are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel this time? Right before the ascension in Acts 1. And so that's where everyone's head was at. Speaking of prophecy, let's look over to let's turn over to um, Acts 3. Um, we have a prophecy, and I believe we looked at this in an earlier message back in Deuteronomy 18, um, that prophesies of a prophet like Moses coming. And in Acts 3:22, this is linked to Jesus. Um, uh, Acts 3:22 says, "For Moses truly said to the fathers, a prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren like me. Him shall you hear in all things, whatever he shall say to you." And so, and that's the passage is back in Deuteronomy 18:15 through 18. Um, and one thing to remember is that Christ did prophesy. Um, let's turn over to Matthew 24, and uh, this is just one passage, but we can be reminded um, in Matthew 24. Um, well, let's just pick up the beginning of the chapter. And this is part of a really long, I mean, you could go into chapter 25, and he's still going um, with prophecy. But at the beginning of chapter 24, it says, "And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, uh, Don't you see all these things? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And Jesus answered and said to them, Take heed that no man deceive you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am Christ, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. Uh, and he goes on to describe the tribulation, um, just hitting a couple points. Down in verse 15, he says, When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, and that's down in Daniel 9:27. Um, when you see this abomination standing in the holy place, whoso reads, let him understand. Then let them which are in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house, neither let him who is in the field return back to take his clothes, and so on and so forth. And what is this? This is prophecy. Specifically, this is talking about the midpoint of the tribulation. And so um, he goes on to describe this in more detail. Um, and there's a lot of prophecy here in this passage. And so we have prophecy from Christ, and that's another characteristic that we can find in the Old Testament. Another thing we can find in the Old Testament is over in Psalm 110, and this is something that is quoted or referred to multiple times in the New Testament. Um, and it's a very interesting um, it's an interesting thing to look at. It says in verse 1, the Lord said to my Lord, you sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. And this verse is quoted in multiple places. Um, we'll look at one instance of that, but I want to point out um, the names and the pronouns being used here, especially in verse 1. Um, when I look at my English, the first several words are the Lord said unto my Lord. Those two lords are two different words in the Hebrew. Um, so if I just use the Hebrew, it's saying Jehovah says to my Adonai, you, Adonai, sit at my Jehovah's right hand until I, Jehovah, make your Adonai's enemies your footstool. And I'm just kind of supplying that for the pronouns so you can see. Um, David is using two different words that are used for God in the Old Testament, Jehovah and Adonai. And this continues with the rest of the psalm. Um, we can look at Matthew 22. Let's look over at Matthew 22, and this is an example of this verse being quoted in the New Testament and pointed out. Um, in this case by Jesus in Matthew 22:41. It says here, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, saying, What do you think of the Christ? So what do you think of the Messiah? In other words, whose son is he? Again, Christ and Messiah, that they're both referring to the anointed one. Um, and so he's asking, whose son is the Messiah? And they say to him, the son of David. And he says to them, How then does David in spirit call him Lord, saying, The Lord said to my Lord, Sit you on my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. If David then called him Lord, how is he his son? This is a good question. And it's one the Pharisees are not really willing to answer, because the answer, of course, is that he is deity. And this isn't, this is something Jesus has claimed multiple times. How many times did Jesus Christ say, I am? Thinking of, put your mind back to Moses at the burning bush. And how many times did Jesus say, you know, uh, what did he tell the Pharisees another time before uh, Abraham was, I am? And so he uh, claimed to be deity. And here he makes the point in quoting the Psalm that the Psalm said the Messiah is deity. Um, and if you look back at Psalm 110, you can see the description given in the rest of the Psalm. Um, it's very interesting, but uh, he makes this point with that first verse of the Psalm. Doesn't make any sense for David to be saying this if he's simply a human descendant of David, which he is, but he is also Adonai. And so um, that's something that's also quoted in multiple places. And so we're picking up just some characteristics of the Messiah here. Let's see. Let's go ahead and go to Matthew 12. And we're in Matthew. Let's just turn to Matthew 12. And we'll pick up another prophecy that's referenced. Um, and so, once again, we're hitting some of the things we've noticed earlier this morning. In verse 13, um, a man is healed, uh, a man who had his hand withered up in verse 10. Um, and this is interesting. Let's actually just pick up verse 9. Um, I don't have time to do this, but we'll do it anyway. Verse 9, because this will give us again the picture of what's going on with some of the rejection of the Messiah. Verse 9 says, and when he was departed from there, he, Jesus, went into their synagogue, and behold, there was a man who had his hand withered. Um, and they asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days? So that they might accuse him. And so, again, under the law, the Sabbath day, the seventh day of the week, you did not do work on that day. And they had come up with additional regulations in order to uh, determine exactly how much work or how little work they could get away with. But that was something in the law. And so their thought is, well, if he performs a miracle on the Sabbath, then that's against the law, and we can accuse him of that. And he says to them in verse 11, what man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep? And if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? How much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath days. And then he says to the man, stretch forth your hand. And he stretched it forth, and it was restored whole, like the other. And then the Pharisees went out and held a council against him, how they might destroy him. And so you see their response. But when Jesus knew it, he withdrew himself from there, and great multitudes followed him. And he healed them all, and charged them that they should not make him known, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, Behold my servant, whom I have chosen, my beloved, in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will show judgment to the Gentiles. He will not strive, nor cry, neither shall any man hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed shall he not break, and smoking flax shall he not quench, till he send forth judgment unto victory, and in his name shall the Gentiles trust. And so he's quoting Isaiah there. Um, it's Isaiah 42, I believe specifically. But you can see the Pharisees' reaction. They're not too concerned about the miracle, they're concerned about doing something on the Sabbath. And so Isaiah 42, 1 through 4 is named as the prophecy that's fulfilled with this behavior where instead of, contending with them, and again, as the Son of God, do you think he could win an argument? Uh, you know, he could, there is so much that he could do, that he could say, that he could do in front of everybody. And yet he does not really go out and contend with them. Um, he leaves. And so you see his behavior there. Um, Now um, let's look over at Isaiah 53. And we're going to visit this later when we look at his burial for obvious reasons, but Isaiah 53, 9, um, it says, And he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. This obviously, chapter 53 is a major chapter for Messianic prophecy, and we're going to focus on this in the near future. This verse, the point that he was there was no deceit in his mouth, is referred to in 1 Peter 2:22. We also see in Hebrews 4:15, um, he does not have sin or any sinful quality or nature, no sin nature with Jesus. This is a fairly important point, obviously, for his death on the cross as the perfect sacrifice. Um, Somebody who is without sin. And again, we will be back to Isaiah 53 as a major passage as we go over his death. One more thing I want to look at, and that is parables. Let's turn over to Psalm 78 and look at another thing here that's characteristic of what Jesus did on earth. And we're just looking at several of these things um, in a short amount of time, but these are, things like um, healing people, performing miracles, prophesying, parables. These are all things that we just know. I don't even need to go to the Gospels and give you, now here's an example of Jesus telling a parable, because it's, he's known for that. His time on earth is known for the parables he told. we will give an example of him telling parables anyway, but um, in Psalm 78, well, let's read the first few verses. It says, "Give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us." And, this is, I know it says at the top it's of Asaph, but is this Asaph's law that we're talking about? He says, I will give ear to my people to my law. I will open my mouth in a parable. Um, and let's turn over to Matthew 13. And we're going to see this quoted in connection with some parables in Matthew 13:34. And he's been earlier in this chapter, telling the people a ton of parables. And so in verse 34, it says, "All these things Jesus spoke to the multitude in parables, and without a parable he did not speak to them, that it might be fulfilled that was spoken by the prophet, saying, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things which have been kept secret from the foundation of the world." Or And then Jesus sent the multitude away and went into the house, and his disciples came to him, saying, "Declare to us the parable of the tares of the field." And so, he tells the disciples the meaning, but not the multitude. It's interesting if we look over up at verse 10, we get a bit of an explanation uh, as to why so many parables. In verse 10, it says, "And the disciples came and said to him, Why do you speak to them in parables? And he answered and said to them, Because it is given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of the heavens, but to them it is not given. For whoever has, to him it will be given, and he will have more abundance. But whoever has not, from him will be taken away even what he has. And therefore I speak to them in parables, because seeing they see not, and hearing they hear not, neither do they understand. And in them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah, who says, By hearing you will not hear, and will not understand, and seeing you will see, and will not perceive." For this people's heart uh, is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes have closed, lest at any time they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and should understand with their heart, and should be converted, and I should heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. And he goes on, but he gives the point of, you know, you might ask, why are you talking in parables? Why don't you just speak plainly? And his point is, well, I'm on purpose not speaking plainly. Um, because as he says to the disciples, it is given to you to know the mysteries, the secret of the kingdom of the heavens. And that's a reference to the Messianic kingdom that was promised and was being offered, but was also rejected. Um, and so one of the things um, I might do in a couple weeks is take a look more specifically at that offer and rejection, because this is one of the things that can be really confusing uh, if you do not realize that it's happening, if you don't realize there's a kingdom prophesied in the Old Testament, the Messiah has come, he's offering this kingdom, but that offer's been rejected, and the kingdom is going to arrive later during the millennium. There are a ton of things that become very confusing if that's not clear. And so there's a lot of things in eschatology that deal with that. But also just simply reading the Gospel of Matthew could be confusing because the Gospel of Matthew really focuses on Jesus as Messiah and gives some details about his description and offer of the kingdom of the heavens that the other three Gospels don't give. They don't give it in as much detail. So um, we may look more at that in a couple of weeks and kind of look at this rejection and the effect it had on Messianic prophecy, because really there's a lot of Old Testament, there's a lot of Messianic prophecy in the Old Testament about the Messiah and about the kingdom that has yet to be fulfilled because the offer was rejected. And we look at the Old Testament and we see a lot of things said about the kingdom that will happen during the 1,000 years. Um, we tend to focus, I guess, in Messianic prophecy on fulfilled prophecy, but it's important to remember that there's some things related to the kingdom that the Jews were expecting that was rejected, and uh, that's one of the things that caused the Jews to not understand what was going on and be very confused when the Messiah was crucified.